Okay, so if you've been following along, I've been working on this API to generate alt text. And so today, what I wanted to do was show you how I use GitHub and specifically how I use a GitHub action to both uh, PR my app, run tests, format it, and then more importantly, how when a PR like that is merged into my main, I actually automatically deploy it to my personal server and run it in a Docker container. So let's take a look at what I have set up here locally so you can get an idea for how I do this using GitHub Actions. So we'll go ahead and change into software projects, and then we'll go into the AltGen directory. We'll go ahead and open up this in NeoVim, and then the stuff we are interested in looking at is going to exist under a .github directory. So if you're not familiar with GitHub Actions, the way you identify workflows or actions that GitHub can run or that you can run on GitHub is by creating a .github directory, and then inside that you create a workflows directory, and then in the workflows directory you put the actions that you want to be able to actually have GitHub run for you. So the first one we'll take a look at is the pull request action, and I'm just going to step through kind of each bit of this. If you are familiar with GitHub Actions, then some of this will kind of be no of use to me, but what I usually do is I usually give my action kind of a name for what its purpose is. In this case, it's for handling pull requests. And then the next thing I set up is some defaults. So these are defaults that will be applied to subsequent jobs or actions within this workflow. And then so in this case, I'm setting it to the working directory of source because that's where all my code lives that actually I'm going to format and test. This way, when I execute commands in my subsequent jobs, I don't have to always specify source as part of the path or change into that source directory before I execute the command or execute the action I want to take. After this, I add some events. So these are events under which I want these actions to run. In this case, I want the ability to dispatch this manually if I want to, but more importantly, I want this action to run on a pull request. So if somebody opens up a pull request and there are changes under these specific paths, so if there's any changes under source altgen API or source altgen API.test, then I want this to run. And it also needs to be a pull request that's targeting my main branch. So this won't run if somebody opens a PR that goes into a different branch other than main. Next, I define the jobs that I want to run. So in this case, I want to run two jobs. I want to run a job that ensures proper formatting of my code. So in this case, I'm going to run the .NET format command. And in order to do this, I do need to give this action the permissions to actually write to the contents of my repo. Next, I set up the steps that I want to run. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm checking out my repository, which is almost a step you're going to have on every single GitHub workflow that you write. Then I'm going to set up .NET because you actually need the .NET SDK available so that you can have that .NET CLI. Next, I'll actually run the .NET format command. And then after that format command runs, I give it my changes. So I actually commit these changes to the repo so that they actually are reflected in the repository. And to do that, I'm just running a small, simple kind of shell script where I configure git, and then I check to see, hey, do I have some changes? If so, then I add them, I commit them, and then I just rebase and push back to the head. Then the next one is I build and I test. So this is always a good step to have somewhere in your PR process. If you're doing the right thing and actually writing tests, you should also have an automated CI/CD process that then just goes ahead and runs your tests when you open a PR. That way you know if anything in your PR actually broke some of your tests. This is going to be very similar to the job up above where I'm again going to check out the repository. I'm going to set up .NET so I have that SDK locally on the runner. And then I'm just going to restore my project, build it, and then test it. I do want to point out that when I'm testing this project in my CI/CD pipeline, I'm excluding my prompt evaluation tests because those could be kind of flaky, as we saw when we were writing them. There's probably some work I need to do to kind of make those prompt evals a little bit more robust, so I'm just excluding them for now. I still will run my one end-to-end test that has nothing to do with evaluating my prompt. So I'll still get that end-to-end test coverage. I'm just going to exclude those specific prompt evaluation tests that are actually end-to-end. And this could cause, obviously, running my CI/CD with that end-to-end test running could cause my CI/CD to break sometimes. Let's say Gemini's overwhelmed, or in the future when I've implemented other providers, if those APIs are overwhelmed, it's possible I could get some false negatives from my CI/CD. But if that becomes an issue, I can then just exclude those two if I don't want to deal with that. Okay, now the real meat and potatoes of this is the deploy workflow. So this is how I actually get my application up and running on my server. And so I'm using a very simplistic deployment process. All I do is I package my app up into a Docker container. I push that Docker container up to Docker Hub. And then all I have to do is I have to SSH into the server where I want this application to actually run. And then I pull the image and run it. So let's walk through how I do that with my workflow. Again, I just give my action a good name that's descriptive of what it does, and then I give it some events. So I always want to be able to deploy manually if I choose to, if I want to deploy some changes, or I want to actually just kick off a deployment to test some other things. Maybe I change some configurations with my proxy, my reverse proxy. I want to be able just to kick off that deployment process manually. Then I put the push event. So if I ever push to the main branch of this repo, we're going to kick off this action as long as the changes don't match one of these paths, right? So if I change something in the GitHub folder, I don't want to redeploy my app. If I change something in the git ignore, the editor config, or the license, the readme, I don't want to have any of that kick off a deployment. So I'm excluding those paths. But anything else, any other changes, they should cause a deployment on a push into my main. So the way you can think of this is like my pull request action is going to run when I open up my PR. When my PR is approved and merged into main, that's going to trigger a push into main. And then this deployment action will kick off to actually deploy my app. And then I have my job. So my first job is I'm going to build. And so in the context of this deployment process, building my application is all about building that Docker image. So we set up that Docker file in a couple videos ago. You can go back and look at that. It's called How I Dockerize My .NET APIs if you're interested. But now I have a Docker file in my API directory, and I can actually show that to you. So it's right here. This is my Docker file. And so that's going to package all that code up and actually put it into a nice little box that I can run with Docker and have the app up and running. So the way we do that on GitHub Actions is we first check out our repo because we actually do need to pull that code down to our runner. Then we're going to log into the Docker Hub so that way we can push to Docker Hub when we're ready. We're going to create a tag for this image that we're going to build. In this case, I'm using very simple versioning. All I'm going to do is I'm going to get the current date in a particular format, and then I'm also going to get the short commit, the short SHA for my commit, and I'm going to put that together and separate them by a hyphen and use that as my tag. Or I guess I should say I'm going to use that as part of my tag. Next, I'm going to build and push the image. So in order to do that, I'm going to create a simple set of commands here where the first thing I'm going to do is just create the tag I'm going to use. So this is a combination of a couple things. The tag is obviously going to be my Docker Hub username. Then it's going to be the repo, the Docker Hub repo I want to push this image to, and then the specific version of that image, which is going to be that version that I created in the previous step. Once I've got that tag, I'm going to run the docker build command and give it that tag, and then docker push to push that image to Docker Hub. So now that I've got the container and the image built and pushed up to Docker Hub, all I need to do is now get onto my server, pull that updated image down, and run it. So the next step I have here is the deploy step. So I've got my build process, now I have my deploy process. My deploy process is really simple again. All I have to do is run the image on my server. So I use this particular GitHub action, which just makes it a little bit more convenient and a little bit more ergonomic to SSH into a server through a GitHub action. And there's a couple things you have to provide. You have to provide it the particular host where you're SSHing into, your SSH username, and your key, right? So this is going to basically run the exact same command you would on your local machine if you were going to SSH into your server. It's just going to do it for us on our GitHub action on our runner. And then the next thing is the actual script that we want this GitHub action to run for us as part of our workflow. Once we're SSH into our server, what do we actually want to do on the server? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run docker stop. So in case there's an existing image already running, I want to stop it. Then I want to remove it. And then I want to pull the image that we just built. So that's using the docker pull command. And in this case, I just want to give it that exact same tag that I built earlier, which again is going to be my Docker username, the name of that repo, and then that specific version, which is why you need to make sure and output that version to an outputs so that you can reference it between jobs in your workflow. And then finally, once I have that image, that new image on my server, I can run it. So I'm going to write docker run and then -d so it runs in the background. And then I'm going to map some ports. So this is the port that's running, my app is running on in the container or listening on in the container. And I'm going to map it to a port that's actually listening on my server. And so this just needs to be an open port that's available. I'm going to give it a name. So I'm giving it that name so that I can reference it on subsequent deployments to stop and remove it. And then again, I am going to tell it I want to run this particular version of my image. And so this could probably be cleaned up a little bit. I probably could store these in a variable somewhere, but in this case, I'm just reiterating the exact tag I want, the exact image I want, and then I'm running it. So what should happen now is whenever I push into main, this is going to run, build my image, and deploy it. And so I just want to show you it actually working. So let's go ahead and head over to GitHub, and we'll actually just manually dispatch a deployment. So repositories, go to AltGen. We will go to workflows. No, we'll go to actions. Sorry, we'll go to actions. We'll go to deploy, and then we'll just kick off a manual flow. And so now it should be building and pushing to Docker once this job gets picked up by a runner. So we'll check out my repo. We're going to log into the Docker Hub. We're going to create a version. We're building and pushing. So now if I go to Docker Hub, let's see, you can see I was here earlier today. We should have a new image show up here in just a moment. Yep, so you can see here's the new tag or the new image just a few seconds ago. And then now my server, I'm going to log in and look, it already executed the command. So it logged in, it found one was already existing, it removed it, it pulled the newer image, and then it ran it. So now that's actually running on my server, and so I can show you that. So if I come over here, oh, actually, let's just hit it with the browser. So now if I hit, oh, and I also set up, obviously this is running behind a reverse proxy, so obviously you have to do your web server configuration, but the actual API is running on my server listening on localhost 7778. So I have that I have a CNAME record set up at my hosting provider, which directs traffic coming to that domain, to a particular domain, to my server. And then I have Nginx running on my server, which is going to route that traffic to my actual application on that localhost port. So if I hit https://api.altgen.stephenfreeborn.com, we're going to get a response. which is just it. I have nothing served on that route. But if I was to open Postman, and we're going to replace this with our actual real URL, and then we'll go ahead and send a request. And if it all works right, we should be able to get some alt text back. And we'll see. It may take a couple attempts here to make it work because of the way I have this server hosted and from where I'm. There we go. So there we go. We got our alt text back. Baby Yoda, a small green alien-like character from Star Wars series, is standing upright, blah, 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 which is exactly the image that we sent it. So there we go. So we're generating some alt text. Awesome. So it's up and running on my server, and that's how I go about deploying things in this very simple fashion. So it's just, again, it's just two workflows and really one workflow to get it deployed, which is I build the Docker image, I push it up to Docker Hub, and then SSH into my server, pull the image down, and run it. And then obviously you have to set up, again, you have to go onto your server, depending on how how that server's set up, but you're going to have to also do the reverse proxy configuration, which I'm not showing you that because it's kind of outside of the scope of what I wanted to demo for you. But if you're interested in me showing that, leave a comment. I'd be happy to walk through that with you. But it's relatively simple. It's just setting up your domain, your subdomain, or whatever domain you want to host it at, pointing that at your server, and then for your whatever web server you're using, changing that configuration so that it routes traffic to a particular domain or particular server name, in the case of Nginx, to that Docker container that's running on your server. So I hope that was helpful. If you have questions, obviously, leave a comment. If you think there are things that I could do differently or better to make this a better setup or better deployment process, let me know. I'd be happy to hear about those too.